This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, February 17th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. You might remember about 3 months ago when regular guest Pete the Planner predicted that President Donald Trump's plans for tariffs could have a pronounced effect on some elements of Indiana's economy. Trump wasted little time once his second term began last month, threatening a barrage of tariffs on many of America's trading partners, and in particular, Canada, Mexico, and China, who are among Indiana's top 6 importers of goods. For example, on February 1st, Trump said he would implement a 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. On February 3rd, he agreed to a 30-day pause on tariffs against Mexico and Canada. On February 9th, Trump said he would impose 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports. Those tariffs aren't set to go into effect until March 12th. However, as IBJ has learned from Indiana companies in the last several weeks, simply the threat of tariffs against a trading partner can be disruptive for American companies. All of our reporters have been working on stories about tariffs, but we left the big picture to the newest addition to our reporting bullpen, someone who is uniquely qualified to investigate the interplay of tariffs and manufacturing. You might already be familiar with Daniel Lee, a longtime Indiana business journalist who also has significant experience in the state's manufacturing sector. He's making his debut on the IBJ podcast this week to first give us a broad-based assessment of the risks posed by tariffs, and then provide some specific examples of companies dealing with vulnerability to the effects of tariffs. That includes one major firm that largely has been able to inoculate itself against tariffs on imported goods. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Daniel Lee, who covers healthcare and philanthropy for IBJ. Thank you for making time today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Our regular listeners will know that up until recently, John Russell covered healthcare for IBJ, and we gave him a retirement send-off on the podcast at the end of the year. IBJ was incredibly fortunate that Daniel was interested in taking over the position. He's a seasoned business journalist who also has significant experience in Indiana's manufacturing center, which is relevant for today's podcast. I am sorry to put you on the spot, but just by way of introduction, give us the elevator pitch for Daniel Lee.
Sure, no problem. Actually, John Russell and I sat next to each other. We're part of the same healthcare reporting team at the Indianapolis Star from 2005 to 2010. He actually started out as an editor and was my editor for a little bit. So we overlapped for a week or two. When I started here at the IBJ, I've been here for about 2 months. I spent 17 years in journalism, newspaper journalism before, mostly in Indiana, starting at a small paper, Greensburg Daily News in Decatur County, worked at the Muncie Star Press, the Times in Northwest Indiana. We did one little stint out in California. I was at the San Jose Mercury News, but then we wanted to come back home to Indiana, so came to the Indianapolis Star. And 2010, I left journalism for 14 years, and almost all of that I spent at a company called SRAM, which is a Chicago-based manufacturer maker of bicycle components, high-end bicycle components. And here in Indianapolis, they acquired some years ago, 2008, Zip Wheels, Zip Speed Weaponry, as it was known, which grew out of really founded by an auto racing engineer who had expertise in carbon fiber. So I worked 13 and a half years in the Zip factory. We had an office there. It's in Pike Township, 56 and Guyan Road. And I will say my favorite thing about the job, I wrote content and product messaging and copy. Just about my favorite part of my daily routine was walking out in the factory, talking to engineers, workers. When you started work there at Zip, they had you make a wheel your first week. And so I still have mine in my office at home. It didn't pass inspection to ride. Actually, working with carbon fiber is interesting. And really that experience gave me a great perspective. Working in a factory, a global company with manufacturing sites in multiple continents, supply chain issues, foreign competition, all those kinds of things that went into reporting this story.
Yeah, you're the man for the job. That's great. You also, I'm just going to say parenthetically, are an avid cyclist. So you're
Yes.
working for the right company and have been instrumental in helping promote the legacy of Major Taylor in Indianapolis. We are going to save that for another podcast.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
We're
there's
a block away from the mural that I helped organize, not paint, but yeah.
Okay. Well, right on. Let's move on to tariffs. Of course, you came on board at IBJ just in time for a new presidential administration and a sea change in economic policy. So in the latest issue of IBJ, you have a piece about the tariffs enacted in the first month of the second Donald Trump presidency. And this is something that we talk about a lot in the newsroom, really in great detail, as we figure out the best way to cover new tariffs, because the subject and the way that President Trump has rolled out the tariffs have been, I mean, the best word I have for it is slippery. What was the biggest challenge about writing about these tariffs when you were doing reporting?
Right. When we discussed this story with the editors, we really wanted to look at, the impact on Indiana, on central Indiana, our readership, but also which kind of companies, businesses, entities could either see gains or be particularly hurt by this. Certainly, the biggest challenge in reporting the story is really the headline. As one of the economists I talked to said, is the headline here is really the uncertainty. And tariffs are big actions, in our kind of global free trade world, but yet effects take a little while to roll out, and particularly when you have this method where things are being enacted, paused, negotiated all at once in big things done in very sudden ways. With the global market is just incredibly complex with supply chains, with modern products.
I wanted to bring up an example of how difficult it is to wrap your arms around this. So the president threatened within the last couple of days to sign an order instituting retaliatory tariffs on any tariffs imposed by any other country on the United States. And he suggested that the order would come on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. And Tuesday passed without tariffs being officially announced, and the press asked Trump if he would sign the order on Wednesday, and he said, "We'll see what happens." So it's difficult, I imagine, trying to nail stuff down when you're writing this kind of story.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, even after I turned my story in, there were multiple significant things that had to be added into the story later on because it's such an evolving issue.
Pursuant to what you just said, I mean, I hate to give away the ending at the beginning of the podcast. My impression is that there aren't many definitive things that we can say about the effects of Trump's tariffs in Indiana, but it is pretty easy to find industries and particular companies that are likely to be affected. Because this is still kind of new to me, and I forget what happened 8 years ago. Let's start easy, and I mean really easy. What is a tariff?
Right. Well, that's always a good place to start. And actually, I was looking around for that, and the best, easiest definition that I found online is from the Council of Foreign Relations. A tariff is a tax imposed on foreign-made goods paid by the importing business to its home country's government. So that's one thing to note, is usually tariffs are paid by the importer. And one of the economists just basically said, like a tariff is a tax.
Okay. So I'm the king of Macedonia, and I make automotive parts, and a tariff has been imposed on me by President Trump. And so when you, an automobile manufacturer, buy my parts, you are the one who is paying the tariff.
If I'm importing.
If you're importing it from me.
Yeah. Is that, what was the name of the country?
Macedonia.
Macedonia, yes.
Actually, that might be a real country. I better look that up. Or just say it's my country.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was clear. So let's take a look at the state for foreign trade in Indiana. From which countries does Indiana import the most goods besides Macedonia?
Yes. Well, in 2023, Indiana imported more than $91 billion worth of goods from countries around the world. The top country of origin was Ireland, which sent almost $21 billion in goods. Canada was second with $11 billion. China third with $8 billion. And then into some European countries, Switzerland, Germany, and then Mexico.
Okay. And Mexico there at the sixth spot is about $6 billion.
$6 billion, yes. Yeah. And so Switzerland and Germany a little over 6, and then Switzerland getting toward 8.
And what do these countries what do they export to Indiana?
So for Ireland, it's mainly organic chemicals and pharmaceuticals. Canada is agriculture products, motor parts, motor vehicle parts, which we mentioned in the story, energy. Another one mentioned in the story is lumber, iron and steel alloys, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of things. From China, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery, electronics. Switzerland, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery. Germany, medicines as well. In Mexico, motor vehicle parts, hardware, electrical equipment, things like that.
Okay. And then what is the point of a country like the United States imposing tariffs on imports from particular countries? What's the end game, or what is the strategy of tariffs?
Right. Well, I think in this case, or in many cases, it's about leverage and some of the things that the White House has said or things that have been written about that is, tariffs can be seen as a powerful source of leverage, protecting national interests. And that was part of when President Trump issued the order using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, talking about the secure border and things like that. So national security. Trump mentioned the trade deficit. It's also a source of revenue. So there's reasons along those lines.
Okay. And he mentioned, right, it can be a bargaining chip.
For sure. And I think
in a negotiation.
I think that's a huge point here is, I asked one of the economists I talked to about that. And certainly for countries around the world, the U.S. is such a gigantic economic market that the United States has a lot of economic leverage. And I think the president's trying to, he saw himself as the master negotiator, right? And he's trying to leverage that, I think.
Yeah. And I think back in the first administration, I think he at one point called himself Tariff Man.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Just to point up how much he loves them. Yeah. And as I recall in the negotiations with Canada and Mexico, one of the things that he was interested in was in better drug interdiction, or that they would be better at policing the borders, allowing drugs to come into the United States.
That's exactly right. And that was really to the heart of that order, that executive order that he gave. Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the common criticisms of tariffs is that they can raise the price of goods for consumers. Let me make sure I understand how that happens.
Well, anytime a business faces increased costs and, producing their goods, they have choices. They can either eat that and have lower profit margins or go into losses, or they can pass that on in whole or part. And so you have kind of this trickle-down effect of just like anything else. When something taxes increase or raw materials increase, eventually that's going to work its way through the supply chain and to the stores where you buy things or online where you buy things.
Let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm, with more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast. In my interview with Daniel Lee about the potential effects of President Trump's tariffs on Indiana businesses. Is there something about Indiana's economy that makes it more vulnerable than most states to Trump's tariffs, and even potentially to retaliatory tariffs from America's trading partners?
Yes, I think with some of the people I talked with, they started, without even being prompted in that direction, kind of talking about the manufacturing sector of it. We're a major, obviously, manufacturing state in the heartland of America. And so I think manufacturers, they're the importers and exporters directly, not just the consumers. And so that's really the center of Michael Hicks from Ball State saw Indiana as, if not the most vulnerable, one of the 3 most vulnerable states, probably along with the other top manufacturing states for tariffs.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's actually the first quote in the story, so it was...
Okay, wow. Now, President Trump sometimes announces his intention to impose tariffs and then pulls back, and actually we just gave you an example of that. Just so we have a sense of what is at least sort of concrete, can you summarize for us quickly the the tariff talk and then the tariff action up to this point?
Yeah, so we have a timeline with this story where we tried to kind of lay this out because it was very fast changing. And February 1st was, 25% tariffs on goods from Canada, except energy, which would be at 10%, 25% on goods from Mexico, 10% additional tariffs on goods from China. Just a couple days later, there was a 30-day pause put on the tariffs with Mexico and Canada. The next day, the Chinese tariffs went into effect. The Chinese government responded to the tariffs on the Chinese government responds with tariffs on American coal, liquefied and natural gas, farm machinery, things like that. So that started. And then just recently, Trump said he will impose 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports.
Okay, which is something that I do recall from the first administration.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, in general, what do economists, businesses, and trade groups think of Trump's tariffs moves?
Yeah, I would say that especially with like a macro economists, it was a very, very dim, view of the tariffs overall. And I think they just see it as interfering with the benefits of trade between nations and free trade. Now, while they said that, they certainly acknowledged that there are sectors, businesses that are set up for certain gains within that. If they have supply chains that aren't affected by the tariffs, and they have their competitors are from nations that would face the tariff penalty, that would make their goods more expensive versus that homegrown company, those could be winners. But I think overall, there's been a lot of reports that this will trickle down and into higher even unemployment, inflation, increased costs of goods on all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. And I think, there certainly is a school of thought where folks say, this is all about negotiation. This is, like you say, this is all about the master deal maker. The point was to get Mexico and Canada to the table to talk about drugs or other, things that Trump finds inequitable about our relationship. And that happened.
Right.
So that's good.
It could be. We'll see how this all plays out. I think certainly that is a negotiating way, is to use kind of a disruptive style. And there's, that's been done before. I think from what businesses and economists were telling the IBJ is that what's hard to deal with is the uncertainty. And, businesses love certainty. Our whole economy is based on, being able to get what you want, and companies maybe not even want to hold tons of inventory, but know that things are going to be coming, and they have long relationships with many different suppliers. And so it makes it hard to plan when there's a lot of uncertainty.
Right. Okay. You had a great example in the story about how these one set of tariffs can compound as a product pings through the supply chain. I think you use motor vehicles. Can you kind of run through that real quick? Sure.
Well, I got some information from Subaru, which is a huge plant in Lafayette, and their cars have an average of like more than 2,000 parts, individual parts. And I think they said, let me see, I'm looking for it, but I think it was like 260 suppliers that they use. 30 of those are from Indiana, and they make a huge volume of cars. In late June, they're expecting to make their 6 millionth car. And it's pretty amazing. They have 6,500 employees, including 5,500 in production. And so when you're making changes or facing changes with a business that complex, it's gonna be hard to manage and hard to predict.
Mm-hmm. I want to underline again the importance of manufacturing to Indiana's economy. How big a portion of our economy is manufacturing?
Right. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, in 2023, manufacturing accounted for 18% of the state's workforce and a little bit more than a quarter of the state's domestic product. So it's really hard to overstate how big of a part it is of our economy.
And the industries with significant manufacturing operations, and the ones we write about all the time, are pharmaceuticals like Eli Lilly and Company, the automotive makers, people who use steel.
One group that has been talking about this is the Indiana Manufacturers Association, which represents a huge swath of a wide variety of manufacturers. And really not even every manufacturer in the state is part of them. But talking with Andrew Berger, the CEO, he talked, one of the things he brought out was the automakers as being particularly vulnerable because, as we had mentioned a few minutes ago, with the complexity of their supply chains, and also just he said that the auto sector in Indiana is highly integrated with the Canadian market, which is one of the targets, although on pause now for these. And so that's real exposure for them.
Mm-hmm. And tell me if I'm right about this. So we import the parts to a great degree to make the cars, and then we export the cars. So if we are exporting the cars to a country with retaliatory tariffs, does that hurt us?
Yes. I mean, it would make good if automakers from Indiana are facing tariffs in the countries they're coming into, that importer is going to be paying that. It's going to make the goods more expensive. And one other thing to consider is that with these supply chains, so like an automaker will have its list of suppliers, but then its suppliers have their list of suppliers. So you go on these tiers of suppliers, and if it's a major part of the car, there's multiple suppliers. If they're facing increased costs, it's going to be wrapped in, even though that may not be a direct supplier to the end goal of that part being in a car.
And again, raises the price of the car.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's look at some other examples. I know that we've looked at Jasper-based Kimball Electronics, which I think we knew from as kids by playing their organs, but they have a very wide-ranging global operation.
Yeah.
Now with automotive, industrial, medical markets.
I think one thing that was fortuitous about reporting this story is that it came during corporate earnings season. So public companies are hosting calls with Wall Street analysts reporting on their earnings. And for a lot of these companies, even if the company didn't mention tariffs in their prepared remark, in numerous cases, analysts were asking them questions, and they want to answer those questions to Wall Street. So it was good to get the perspective that way during this. And one of those earnings calls was with Kimball, as you mentioned, and the CEO, Richard Phillips, talked about that. And he said that the company's Mexico facility exports about 25 to 30% of its production into the United States. And he said Kimball's U.S. facilities import components from China, Mexico, Canada on customers' behalf to use in manufacturing of their products. Then this was a quote from him. There are a variety of options we will continue to review with our customers. Our customers may be able to change Kimball's final delivery location, shift production to another Kimball facility, or pay the tariff. And from those options, you can see that those are definite options, but those seem to me like they would be complex changes to make within big businesses.
For sure. Indiana has a robust life sciences industry, and we know that one of the main imports into the state are chemical components for medicines. Could that have an effect on companies like Eli Lilly, for example?
It could. It was interesting. Lilly did report their earnings recently, and I did not hear one mention of tariffs on the call. And it's not in the story, but I had emailed Lilly, and they refrained from commenting and referred to their trade group. So they're, and in fact, that's an example. A lot of organizations or companies are really taking a wait and see approach with this. And we definitely received some what I would describe as, carefully worded statements from companies that they're monitoring the situation. Another one that came in a little late that I appreciated them getting back with me was from like the Corn and Soybean Growers Association. And that was another example of that. And most of these statements really talk about the importance of global markets to these businesses and that they're monitoring the situation closely. the BioCrossroads, which advocacy for life sciences in Indiana, the CEO there, Vince Wong, he talked about tariffs having material short-term and long-term effects, but they seem to be waiting and seeing as well. Now, the economist Michael Hicks from Ball State said that sometimes pharmaceutical companies may not be quite as exposed because they have maybe more alternatives to some of the components in their drugs and things like that. Yeah. And it's certainly something worth watching, though, because on that earnings call, I mean, Lilly did get, as you've read about in the IBJ, I mean, Lilly is investing tens of billions of dollars in manufacturing expansion, including a lot of it here in Indiana and also places like Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Right. What about companies that rely on imported building materials like lumber or steel and aluminum, for example?
Yeah, there was a business that's north of Lafayette, up 65 towards Chicago. And
I know what you're talking about. Remington. Yeah, I think I stopped there on my way to Chicago.
Yeah.
to get an energy drink every time I head up to visit my family in Chicago.
FBI buildings.
I'm not that.
But anyways, they were very proactive on this. I played phone tag. I had to try to talk with them, but they published some very interesting information on their website, and they build some really interesting buildings, and including, I can't remember the word they used, but it's almost like barn dominiums or something, like homes.
Oh my God. That's a great term.
Really interesting website, but pole barns, which are really interesting big buildings used in agriculture and others. They talked a lot about potentially higher costs on a spike in lumber prices from Canada. And they said some of that's been happening. And they wrote a blog and they said these tariffs can spike lumber prices, directly affecting the cost of materials for pole barn construction. As Canadian lumber becomes more expensive, domestic mills may struggle to meet demand, resulting in supply chain disruptions and even higher prices. So there you can kind of, one thing that keeps coming up are kind of these ripple effects from things like this. Another was the Fort Wayne-based Do It Best Corp hardware stores.
Right. Do It Best Corp, yeah.
Yes. And, of course, there's lumber and steel, but it was even mentioned that there's a range of smaller products, tools, fasteners that are imported and that are needed for all kinds of projects, large and small, and could have higher prices.
We should point out that the tariffs don't necessarily affect all companies in a particular industry sector. And a good example, getting back onto I-65, is Lafayette-based semi-trailer manufacturer Wabash, which folks probably remember as Wabash National or Wabash Trailer. How has that firm been able to insulate itself from the effect of tariffs?
Right. I've always found them to be kind of an interesting company, and I remember writing a few columns about them when I was at the Indianapolis Star. And so I was interested with their earnings that they had remarked, and then I got in contact with them and got a little bit more information. But they said that they reacted to the first round of Trump tariffs and started changing their supply lines, and that they now have 95% plus of their tier one supply chain is sourced domestically. And they called that a strategic decision made years ago to prioritize domestic partnerships and build a resilient U.S.-based supply chain. The CEO on the earnings call reiterated that.
Mm-hmm. Isn't this in part of the intended effect of tariffs is to bring investment back to the United States?
Yes, I would say so. And Wabash sounded very positive about that. And they called it a good effect for the industry if it would have, the CEO said, speaking more broadly and talking about that effect within the industry, he saw as being positive. And that would certainly match with, I think, some of the things that President Trump on the campaign trail talked about. And also, I think just in recent decades of the last, 30 plus years, there's been a lot of talk about manufacturing in the United States and what kinds of things can we make profitable here? What things should we make here? So this kind of pulls back and look even wider, I think, at an ongoing issue and debate within our nation.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So if we had to wrap it up here, again, the thing that it seems like for the moment manufacturers are dealing with as uncertainty is how do we figure out what's going to happen next week? How do we figure out what's going to happen next quarter? How do we figure out what we're going to need next year?
I guess we have to keep an eye on the news, right? I mean, because, that was one thing that the Purdue economist I talked with, Professor Hummel, said that when businesses have faced so much in uncertainty, they kind of hit the pause button, which could have detrimental effects. Or if they were going to, this isn't what he said, but I'm just saying, if a business maybe were going to expand or something, I don't know if that would affect that. That would be some follow-up stories, but it's definitely having a lot of effect.
Okay. Well, I know we're coming back to this, so let's check in a few weeks and see how it goes.
That's right. I'd be happy to come back. And it was actually a very fascinating story to report. I was in the zone with it for a couple days.
That's good. That's a great feeling. Right on. All right. Well, we'll talk to you then.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Daniel Lee. You can read Dan's reporting in this week's edition of IBJ, which contains a package of stories about Indiana companies addressing the anxiety, uncertainty, and potential opportunities brought by the greater shift toward tariffs in U.S. trade policy. Also in this week's issue, Dave Lindquist dives into the legal battle between the presenters of the Wonder Road Music Festival in 2022 at Garfield Park. And Daniel Bradley explores how landlords, local officials, and real estate developers are trying to revitalize the US 31 office corridor in Carmel. You can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. And I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original this content is. Just go to IBJ.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.